Hello and welcome to discussion on the EU Taxonomy regulation. In this discussion we will investigate what the taxonomy is and why it is important. With me to discuss this topic I have Emilia Jurander Delleborn, who is a sustainable finance legal expert here at Swedbank. Welcome, Emilia.
Thank you, nice to be here.
Nice to have you. Let me start by asking you perhaps the most obvious question. What is the taxonomy?
So taxonomy, it is a EU classification system which defines when an economic activity is environmentally sustainable. And this is done in relation to 6 different environmental objectives. And the first 2 objectives relate to climate, so climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And then the other 4 relate to other environmental aspects, for example, biodiversity and circular economy.
Okay. But so why then has the EU created the taxonomy? What's its objective?
Well, from EU side, it has been to create such a definition of environmentally sustainable activities that has been emphasized as one of the most urgent and important actions. And the reason for that is because by having such a definition, we can ensure that when economy goes to more sustainable investments or similar, those investments are actually sustainable. So this also prevents greenwashing. And greenwashing is, when a company is promoting itself or its products as being sustainable, when actually the positive outcome is limited or maybe even negative.
Yeah. So how then can a company or an activity be classified as environmentally sustainable?
Well, first, the activity needs to substantially contribute to at least one of these 6 environmental objectives mentioned in the beginning.
Okay.
And then second, it cannot do any significant harm to any of the other 5 objectives. And then lastly, the company that is performing this activity, it needs to comply with some minimum social safeguards. So when activity fulfills all of these requirements, then that activity is seen as taxonomy aligned. And I will use that word a lot, so it's good to remember taxonomy aligned.
Okay. And I also heard you say minimum social safeguards. Now, I'm not familiar with that expression, but let us come back to that. First, I just want to make sure I got this. So, to be substantially contribute to at least one of the objectives, not do any significant harm to any of the other objectives, and comply with some minimum social safeguards. Did I get that correct?
Correct, Matthias.
Okay, good. But does this mean that it's up to each company also to decide whether or not their activity fulfills these requirements, or how does it work?
Well, I would say this is what is quite unique with the taxonomy, because it really goes into details defining when is an activity substantially contributing and what are the thresholds for not doing any significant harm. So to answer your question, it's not up to each company to decide, we think this is substantially contribution. That is done on an EU level. And those detailed requirements, those are called technical screening criteria. And currently we have technical screening criteria for the 2 first objectives, so the climate-related ones, and for some sectors. But we will see development, in the future where we will have technical screening criteria for all objectives and for more sectors.
Okay, so the taxonomy is work ongoing, you might say.
Exactly.
Yeah. But what about these technical screening criteria then? Could you provide us perhaps with an example to make us better understand what it is?
I think it's good to take an example of how it actually looks. And I would suggest we take an example that a lot of us can relate to, and that would be acquisition and ownership of buildings. So buying or owning a building. The technical screening criteria are quite detailed, so I will limit it to buildings built before 31st of December 2020. But when is this activity substantially contributing? And that is possible in 2 different ways. The first way is that the building has an energy performance certificate of A. So if you have A, then you are substantially contributing. The other possibility is that your building is within the top 15%, in more easy words, of energy efficient buildings in your country. Okay. And there it's different. The threshold for top 15% differs if we're talking about residential buildings compared to commercial buildings, for example. So that is, if you have one or both of these 2, then you are substantially contributing.
Okay. And what about the do no significant harm criteria?
Well, here actually it's a bit special with this activity is that they solely have these criteria for climate change adaptation, so only for one other objective. As I mentioned at the beginning, it could be for all 5, but here it's for one, makes it easier also for us taking an example. So to not do any significant harm on climate change adaptation, you need to identify, is there any material physical climate risk that this building is exposed to, and then identify those material risks. Then you also need to assess, is there any adaptation solutions that you can apply to mitigate these risks.
So these criteria specify the requirement for substantial contribution and do no significant harm. But then I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier about the minimum social safeguards. What is that?
So this means that a company performing an activity, it also needs to comply with some international acceptable standards in relation to human rights and labor rights. So normally taxonomy is focusing on the environmental aspect or the green aspect. But by including this criteria, it also includes a minimum threshold in relation to the social and the governance. So for example, a company that is doing something very environmentally positive, but they're using child labor to do so, they cannot be taxonomy aligned.
Okay, so taxonomy aligned is when an activity fulfills these criteria. But then I wonder, because I've heard, talking about the taxonomy, another word being mentioned that is fairly similar, which is taxonomy eligible. What does that mean? Is that the same thing or is it something else?
It is 2 different things, but there's often confusion around them. So it's good that we highlight what is difference between them. So taxonomy eligible, if we start with the new word, that is relevant for when we talk about technical screening criteria. As I mentioned, there's solely technical screening criteria for some activities and some sectors. So if an activity has technical screening criteria, that activity is taxonomy eligible. When we talk about taxonomy alignment, it's not sufficient that you only have technical screening criteria. You also need to meet the criteria. So that is the difference between taxonomy alignment and taxonomy eligibility.
Okay, so taxonomy eligible if the criteria, if the activity is covered by the taxonomy, and taxonomy aligned if the activity fulfills these 3 criteria that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you. But then I wonder, would you say that the taxonomy can be used today to describe how a sustainable company actually is?
Well, as mentioned before, there is some limitation to taxonomy today. For example, we only have these technical screening criteria for some environmental objectives and for some sectors. And then, of course, taxonomy is only now focusing on the environmental aspect. So it doesn't cover social. There isn't a social taxonomy yet, for example. So there is limitations to it. However, when looking at activities related to climate and sectors included by the taxonomy, taxonomy can definitely be used to assess sustainability.
Okay, but should I then interpret the taxonomy as such as all activities that are not environmentally sustainable, according to the taxonomy, are then per se harmful to the environment?
Not per se, no. The fact that an activity is not taxonomy aligned does not mean that it's per se is harmful. For example, it could be that activity is not yet covered by taxonomy, but it could also be a transitional activity. So I would say there is quite a middle space also between the harmful activities and the activities that are taxonomy aligned.
Okay. But for me as a customer in Swedbank then, how will I exactly be impacted by the taxonomy?
So you can be impacted by taxonomy in different ways. For example, when we look at the saving side, how taxonomy aligned a financial instrument or insurance product, how taxonomy aligned it is, that is one way to assess if this product is meeting a customer's preferences in relation to sustainability. So this is relevant, when we give investment advice or insurance advice, and both for retail customers and for corporate customers. But then also for corporate customers, it's relevant that taxonomy comes with reporting requirements, and also the ones that are not covered by reporting requirements can be expected that they need to disclose information on how taxonomy aligned is their business.
Okay, so the taxonomy will impact both private customers and corporate customers.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much, Emilia.
Thank you.
And thank you to you who has watched this discussion. We hope it has given you more information on what the taxonomy is and what it aims to do. If you want to know more about how the taxonomy impacts your company, don't miss our discussions on the reporting requirements of both the financial companies and non-financial companies. Thank you for watching.